If you don't move right now, I will have you escorted to economy." The captain said it clearly in the middle of the business class cabin, in front of every passenger seated within earshot. The man in seat 2A didn't argue. He didn't demand to see a supervisor or wave his boarding pass in the air. He simply picked up his worn leather bag, stood without a word, and walked toward the back of the plane. His ticket was valid. His seat was paid for. No one in that cabin knew they had just watched the founder and sole owner of the airline quietly accept being removed from his own aircraft, and by the time the truth surfaced mid-flight, it would already be too late to take any of it back. The flight from Chicago to Los Angeles was scheduled for 4 hours and 20 minutes. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind that came without ceremony. Gray sky pressing flat against the terminal windows, gate agents moving on autopilot passengers, dragging luggage through corridors that smelled like recycled air and burnt coffee. Flight 417 was not a special flight. Nothing about its manifest suggested it would become anything other than routine. Elliot Hayes checked in at the self-service kiosk the same way any other passenger would. He had no assistant with him, no security detail trailing at a discreet distance. He wore a dark wool jacket that had seen too many winters, a plain gray shirt beneath it, and a pair of shoes that were clean, but clearly not new. His leather bag was the kind that looked like it had been carried for decades, because it had. He moved through the terminal without urgency, found a seat near the gate, and waited with his hands folded in his lap, like a man who had nothing to prove to anyone in that building. Which was exactly the point. Elliot Hayes had built Callaway Atlantic Airlines over the course of 22 years, starting with a single regional route and a leased aircraft he could barely afford to fuel. He now owned a fleet of over 140 aircraft, serving 31 domestic and 14 international destinations. He had been on the cover of 2 business magazines, had spoken at enough aviation conferences to lose count, and had more frequent flyer miles credited under his personal account than some pilots accumulated in a career. But no one at Gate B-14 knew any of that. They saw a man in his late 50s, with a worn bag and a forgettable face, and they looked through him, the way people always look through men who don't signal wealth with their clothing. That invisibility was the entire reason he was there. He had been doing this for years, boarding flights unannounced under his own legal name, but without any advance notice to the crew. He never upgraded his seat on these trips, never requested anything special, never identified himself unless directly asked to produce identification. He sat in whatever class matched the ticket he purchased, ate the same food, experienced the same delays, and watched. Mostly he watched. He had learned more about his airline from sitting in row 34 than from any executive report delivered in a conference room. The reports told him what managers wanted him to hear. The cabin told him the truth. Today he was in seat 2A. Business class on Flight 417 was a 2-2 configuration, 2 seats on the left, 2 on the right, 8 rows total. Seat 2A was a window seat near the front of the section angled slightly toward the fuselage. It was not the most premium seat on the aircraft, but it was a legitimate business class seat, with a legitimate business class ticket attached to it. Elliot had purchased it 6 days earlier, through the standard booking portal paying the full published fare. He settled in, placed his bag in the overhead bin, and looked out the window at the ground crew moving luggage carts below. The cabin began to fill. Lauren Whitmore arrived at the business class section, carrying a structured handbag that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and wearing the kind of expression that people develop when they have spent enough years being catered to, that waiting for anything feels like a personal insult. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, dressed in a charcoal blazer and ivory blouse, her dark hair pulled back with the sort of precision that suggested she had an assistant whose sole job was to make sure nothing was ever out of place. She found her seat 2B directly across the aisle from Elliot and arranged herself with the efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times. For a moment, nothing happened. Lauren glanced at her phone, crossed her legs, accepted a pre-departure drink from the flight attendant, without making eye contact. Elliot looked out the window. The ground crew had moved on to the next aircraft. Then Lauren looked at Elliot. It was a brief look, the kind people think they're hiding, but rarely do. Her eyes moved from his jacket to his bag, to his shoes, and something in her expression shifted not dramatically, not into open contempt, but into a particular kind of stillness that people adopt when they've made a judgment they don't intend to say out loud, but also don't intend to revise. She turned back to her phone. Then she looked again. Then she pressed the call button above her seat. Noah Carter appeared within seconds. He was 31 years old, had been with Callaway Atlantic for 4 years, and was good at his job in every measurable way, attentive, composed, quick with a smile that didn't feel manufactured. He genuinely liked working business class, not because of the passengers, but because the rhythm suited him. Fewer people, cleaner service, less noise. He reached Lauren's row and gave her his full attention. Lauren didn't look up from her phone when she spoke. Her voice was low, almost conversational, which somehow made it worse. She told Noah that the man in seat 2A didn't look like he belonged in business class, and that she would appreciate it if someone could verify whether his ticket was legitimate, because she had paid a significant amount of money for this flight, and was not interested in sharing the section with someone who had made a mistake at the kiosk. Noah kept his expression neutral. He was well trained. He glanced at Elliot, who had not moved, had not turned to look, and appeared to be studying a particular point on the horizon beyond the window, and then back at Lauren. He told her he would look into it and excused himself toward the front galley. He pulled up the manifest on the cabin system. Seat 2, a Hayes E ticket class full business fare. Booking confirmed. Payment verified. No flags, no irregularities. The ticket was as valid as any other in the section, more so than some, because it had been purchased at full price, rather than through an upgrade or loyalty redemption. Noah stood at the galley counter for a moment, reading the screen twice, as if the information might change. It didn't. He went back to Lauren and told her in the most diplomatic language available to him that the passenger in 2A had a valid ticket and was fully entitled to his seat. Lauren received this information with a kind of measured calm that was its own form of pressure. She said she understood, thanked Noah by name. She had read his name tag and told him she was sure he was doing his best. Then she asked if there was perhaps someone more senior he could consult given the situation. Noah understood what that meant. He also understood that he had done nothing wrong and that the correct answer was to return to his duties and let the matter close. He knew that. He stood in the galley for another moment and then walked forward to speak to Captain Amelia Brooks. Amelia was completing pre-departure checks in the cockpit when Noah appeared at the door. She was 44, a 15-year veteran of Callaway Atlantic, and had earned her command through a record that left very little room for debate. She was precise, composed, and operated by a set of internal standards that she had spent her career trying to hold herself to. Noah explained the situation in 2 sentences. A passenger in business class had complained that another passenger didn't appear to belong in the section. The second passenger's ticket was fully valid. The complaining passenger was pressing for further action. Amelia asked if there had been any disruptive behavior from the man in 2A. Noah said no. She asked if there had been any policy violation of any kind. Noah said no. Amelia set down the clipboard she was holding. She looked at the instrument panel for a moment, not at any particular instrument, just at the panel in general, and then she asked Noah to describe the passenger in 2A. Noah did. She asked about the complaining passenger. Noah gave her a brief description, including the name pulled from the manifest Lauren Whitmore frequent flyer status, gold tier. What happened next was not a dramatic decision. It did not feel in the moment like a choice that would define anything. It felt like a management call, the kind of small situational compromise that accumulates in any profession until you stop noticing you're making it. Amelia told Noah she would handle it herself and walked back to the business class cabin. She approached Elliot's row directly. She introduced herself as the captain and told him in a tone that was polite but final that there had been a concern raised about his seating, and that she was going to need to ask him to move to an available seat in the economy section for the duration of the flight. She told him his business class fare would be refunded to his payment method, and that the airline apologized for the inconvenience. Elliot looked at her, not with anger, not with disbelief, not with the kind of wounded indignation that might have made the moment easier to categorize and dismiss. He simply looked at her, the way a person looks at something they have decided to remember. He asked calmly and without accusation if there was a problem with his ticket. Amelia said there was no issue with his ticket. He asked if he had done anything to violate cabin policy. She said he had not. He asked what the reason was for the request. She said there had been a complaint from another passenger and that, in the interest of maintaining a comfortable environment in the cabin, she was asking him to relocate. She kept her voice even throughout. She was good at keeping her voice even. It was one of the things she had trained herself to do, and in that moment, it served her poorly because it allowed her to say an unjust thing in a reasonable tone and almost convince herself the two were compatible. Elliot did not argue. He did not ask who had complained, did not raise his voice, did not cite his rights as a ticketed passenger or suggest she consult the airline's own published policies on involuntary seat changes. He stood. He reached into the overhead bin and retrieved his worn leather bag. He settled it on his shoulder and looked at Amelia one more time with an expression she could not fully read, then turned and walked unhurried toward the rear of the aircraft. The business class cabin watched him go. Lauren had returned to her phone. A man in row 4 went back to his newspaper. A woman near the window adjusted her blanket. Within 90 seconds, the section had absorbed what had happened and moved past it with the quiet efficiency of people who had decided it was not their concern. Noah stood at the forward galley and watched Elliot pass. He said nothing. He had the thought that he should say something had the beginning of a sentence, somewhere in the back of his throat. But the moment passed before the words arrived, and then Elliot was beyond the curtain, and the opportunity was gone. Amelia returned to the cockpit. She picked up her clipboard. The pre-departure checklist had 12 remaining items. She worked through them in order methodically the way she always did. The cabin door was sealed at 6:53 in the morning. Flight 417 pushed back from the gate 2 minutes later, right on schedule. By the time they were climbing through 10,000 feet, the business class section had settled into the comfortable, quiet routine of a flight that expected to be entirely unremarkable. In the back of the plane, in a middle seat in row 27, Elliot Hayes placed his leather bag beneath the seat in front of him, looked out the small window at the clouds spreading wide and unbroken beneath the aircraft, and began to observe. He had done this before. He knew how to wait. He knew how to watch the way crew members moved through a cabin when they thought no one of consequence was paying attention, how they prioritized, how they spoke, what they let slide, and what they enforced. He had built an airline on the premise that every passenger in every seat deserved to be treated with basic dignity, regardless of the fare they had paid. And he had spent 22 years trying to make that premise real. Today, inside the first 15 minutes of boarding, it had failed. Not because of a training gap, not because of a policy ambiguity, because a woman had pressed a call button and implied a man didn't look right, and his system had moved to accommodate her without once asking whether the man being removed deserved it. He already knew everything he needed to know, but he was going to stay in that seat for the full 4 hours and 20 minutes because the story was not finished yet. It rarely was. The flight had been airborne for just over an hour when Noah Carter began to feel the weight of what he had not done. It was not a dramatic feeling. It didn't arrive all at once. It came the way discomfort usually comes gradually, in the spaces between tasks, when there was nothing immediate to focus on, and the mind turned back to what it had filed away. He was restocking the forward galley, counting miniature bottles of sparkling water, when the image returned to him. Elliot Hayes standing up from seat 2. I reaching into the overhead bin without a word, and walking to the back of the plane with the unhurried dignity of a man who had decided not to give anyone the satisfaction of watching him break. Noah had checked the manifest before any of it happened. He had looked at the screen and seen a valid ticket, a confirmed booking, a full business class fare paid in full with no irregularities. He had gone back to Lauren Whitmore and told her the passenger was entitled to his seat. That should have been the end of it. He had done the right thing up to that point. And then, when Lauren had asked him to escalate, he had escalated not because policy required it, not because there was any legitimate reason to, but because she had said his name when she thanked him, and something in the tone had made him feel like the path of least resistance led forward rather than back. He set down the water bottles and stood at the galley counter, looking at the curtain that separated the forward section from the rest of the aircraft. It occurred to him, not for the first time in the past hour, that he had never actually seen a passenger removed from business class for having a valid ticket. He had seen upgrades, disputed seat assignments, rearranged due to equipment changes, passengers moved for medical reasons, or family configurations. He had never seen a fully ticketed, fully compliant passenger ask to give up a paid seat because another passenger found his presence inconvenient. He understood intellectually that this was what had happened. He had been part of making it happen. He had handed the situation to Amelia Brooks rather than defend a man he had no reason to doubt, and Amelia had done the rest. He picked up the water bottles again and resumed counting. It gave his hands something to do. The business class cabin had settled into its cruise rhythm laptop screens, open noise-canceling headphones on the low ambient hum of passengers who had paid for the right to be left alone with their work and their comfort. Lauren Whitmore was reading documents from a leather portfolio she had opened across her tray table. She had ordered a second mimosa, 40 minutes into the flight, accepted a warm towel without looking up, and had not mentioned the man from seat 2A since the plane left the ground. For her, the matter was closed. She had raised a concern, the crew had addressed it, and the flight had proceeded exactly as it should. She was the kind of person who moved through the world with the assumption that discomfort once identified and communicated to the appropriate party would be resolved on her behalf. Noah delivered drinks to the last 2 rows of business class, and then did something he had been putting off since they crossed into cruising altitude. He went back to the cabin system and pulled up the full passenger profile for seat 2A. Standard booking systems carried basic information, name, tier status, booking history, any special service flags attached to the account. Noah had checked enough profiles to know what a routine record looked like, and this one was not routine. The account behind the name Hayes E. had been active for over 20 years. The booking history ran longer than the system could display in a single screen. The tier status read at the very top of the loyalty program, a tier that was not publicly advertised, a tier that Noah had seen exactly twice before in 4 years of working for Callaway Atlantic, once on a senior senator's profile, once on the profile of a retired professional athlete. But this account had no note attached, explaining the status, no corporate affiliation, no third-party designation. The status appeared to have been assigned directly and permanently, as though the account itself were foundational to the system rather than added into it. There was a single administrative note at the bottom of the profile, brief and without context, internal, no special treatment to be requested or accepted. Standard service only. Noah read that line 3 times. He looked at it the way a person looks at a sentence that changes the meaning of everything they've already read. The instruction was not unusual. In its content, the airline occasionally flagged accounts for VIP passengers who explicitly requested anonymity, or executives from partner companies who didn't want to be recognized in the cabin. But the phrasing here was different from the standard flag. No special treatment to be requested or accepted. The note didn't say the passenger preferred privacy. It said the passenger had directed the airline on the record not to extend him any preferential treatment. That level of specificity didn't come from a corporate travel department. It came from someone who understood the system from the inside. Noah closed the screen. He opened it again. He looked at the name one more time. Hayes E. He thought about the airline's founder, Elliot Hayes, whose photograph appeared in the lobby of every Callaway Atlantic Operations Center, and whose signature was reproduced at the bottom of every letter the airline sent to employees on anniversaries and holidays. He had never met Elliot Hayes. Most people who worked for the airline never had. Hayes had a reputation for being hands-on in the early years and increasingly internal in the later ones, present in the architecture of the company without appearing often at its surface. Noah had no way to confirm what he was thinking, but the thought was already fully formed, and he could not put it back. He walked directly to the cockpit door and knocked. Amelia answered on the second knock, which meant she had been expecting something. She stepped into the small forward space just outside the cockpit and pulled the door nearly closed behind her. She looked at Noah with the particular attention of someone who has been waiting for a report they already suspected was coming. Noah showed her what he had found on the cabin system, the tier status, the booking history, the administrative note at the bottom of the profile. He did not state his conclusion directly. He let her read the screen. Amelia read it. She read the administrative note twice. Then she handed the tablet back to Noah and looked at the forward bulkhead for a moment, and the particular quality of that stillness told Noah everything about what she had understood. She had been a captain for 9 years. She had handled mechanical diversions, medical emergencies, weather reroutes, and passenger confrontations that required law enforcement at the gate. She was not easily rattled, and she was not rattled now, but something in her expression had changed in the 30 seconds since she had read that screen. It was not panic. It was more precise than panic. It was the expression of someone who has just identified the exact moment in the recent past where a decision went wrong and who is now calculating the distance between that moment and the present with clear, unsparing arithmetic. She asked Noah if there was any way the profile could belong to a different E. Hayes. Noah said the first name was listed as Elliot in the full record. Amelia absorbed this. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said quietly, and without drama, that she understood, and that she needed a few minutes before they did anything else. She thanked Noah for bringing it to her and went back into the cockpit. Noah returned to the galley and stood with his back against the counter. He thought about the man in row 27 sitting in a middle seat in economy, in a jacket that had seen too many winters watching the clouds. He thought about the fact that the man had never argued, never demanded anything, had simply stood when asked, and walked to the back of the plane as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. That composure now read differently than it had an hour ago. It no longer looked like submission. It looked like patience. In the cockpit, Amelia Brooks sat with her hands in her lap and did the thing she always did when she needed to think clearly. She went back to the beginning and followed the sequence of events without editorializing. A passenger raised a concern. Noah escalated it. She made a decision. The decision was to remove a legitimate ticketed passenger from his paid seat to accommodate a complaint from another passenger. She had done it professionally. She had done it calmly. She had used polite language and offered a refund, and none of that changed what it was. She had taken a man's paid seat away from him because someone with a more expensive handbag and a gold tier status had implied he didn't belong there. She had not asked what he had done wrong. She had not required Lauren Whitmore to provide a specific articulable reason for her discomfort. She had weighed 2 passengers against each other using criteria that had nothing to do with policy or safety, and she had chosen the wrong one to protect. That was the truth of it, and she had arrived at it without needing to know who Elliot Hayes was. The fact that he appeared to be the founder of the airline was not the source of the error. It was simply the information that made the error impossible to look away from. If Elliot Hayes had been a retired schoolteacher, or a warehouse manager, or a man who drove a 10-year-old pickup truck and had saved for a business class ticket for 2 years, the wrong would have been exactly the same. The wrong had been committed the moment she walked out of the cockpit, with her mind already half made up, responding to the social gravity of the situation rather than to any legitimate claim. She understood that now, and the understanding sat in her chest like something heavy and irreversible. She checked the flight time remaining, 2 hours and 41 minutes to Los Angeles. In row 27, Elliot had declined the beverage service not out of protest, but because he wasn't thirsty. He was watching the crew, not Amelia, who hadn't come back, but the economy cabin crew, 2 flight attendants he hadn't met before, moving through the aisle with the natural efficiency of people who had internalized their work. They were attentive, without being performative. They smiled at passengers, who made eye contact, moved without unnecessary noise, remembered without being asked that the man in 32C had wanted orange juice. It was good service. It was the kind of service he had spent years building the conditions for, and for a moment it steadied something in him. Then he thought about Noah Carter's face in the forward galley as he had passed through the curtain, and the steadiness receded. Noah had known the ticket was valid. He had gone back to Lauren Whitmore and said so. He had done the right thing clearly, precisely. And then, when the right thing hadn't been enough, he had handed the problem upward and let someone else resolve it in the wrong direction. Noah was not the villain of what had happened. He was something more instructive. He was the person who had been right, who had known he was right, and who had not been willing to hold that position when it cost something. The aircraft hit a brief patch of turbulence, a few seconds of rolling motion that produced a scatter of small sounds throughout the cabin. Drinks, adjusting a bag, shifting in an overhead bin, someone saying, "Oh," softly to no one in particular. Then the air smoothed out again, and the cabin returned to its cruise hum. Elliot looked out the window at the landscape below, brown and wide, and cut through with the silver thread of a river he didn't recognize. He thought about what he was going to do with what he knew. He thought about it the way he thought about most difficult things, not with heat, but with the kind of methodical attention that had carried him from a leased, single-engine aircraft to a fleet of 140. He had not come on this flight to catch anyone. He had come to see what was real. He had seen it. Now the question was what a real response to a real failure looked like, not the response of an owner, but the response of a man who believed that the things his airline claimed to stand for were worth standing for. He had 2 hours and 41 minutes to figure out the answer. Amelia Brooks, somewhere at the front of the plane, was working on the same problem from the other side. Neither of them knew yet that they were going to arrive at the same place. Amelia came out of the cockpit 50 minutes before landing. She had handed control to her first officer with a brief professional explanation she needed to address a cabin matter, and walked through the forward galley without stopping to speak to Noah. He watched her pass through the business class curtain and continue walking past Lauren Whitmore's row, past the dividing wall through the economy cabin door, and down the aisle toward the rear of the aircraft. He stood very still and watched the curtain settle back into place behind her. The economy cabin was quieter than business class in a different way. Not the quiet of people who had paid for privacy, but the quiet of people who had accepted their conditions and made the best of them. Passengers had their headphones on their window shades, adjusted their small tray tables, occupied with the remnants of the snack service. Amelia moved through the aisle with her hands at her sides, not in the quick scan mode she used during routine cabin walks, but deliberately, looking at seat numbers as she passed them. She found row 27 without difficulty. Elliot was in the middle seat, his leather bag at his feet, looking at nothing in particular. The seats on either side of him were occupied a younger man in the window seat, asleep against the wall, an older woman in the aisle seat with a paperback open in her lap. Amelia crouched slightly in the aisle to bring herself to eye level with Elliot, rather than standing over him. She kept her voice low enough that it would not carry to the rows around them. She told him she owed him an explanation, and that she was going to give him one, and that she was not going to ask him to move back to business class, because she understood that moving him now, under these circumstances, would not correct what had happened. It would just be a different version of the same problem. She said that she had asked him to leave his seat that morning without cause. His ticket was valid. His conduct was without issue. And the only reason she had made the request was because another passenger had expressed discomfort, and she had chosen to resolve that discomfort by removing the wrong person. She said she knew that, and she wanted him to hear her say it plainly. Elliot looked at her for a moment. The older woman in the aisle seat had lowered her paperback slightly. Not reading, but Elliot gave no indication that the audience mattered to him one way or another. He told Amelia that he appreciated her coming back. His voice was the same as it had been in business class, unhurried, without edge. He said he had not moved that morning because he wanted to see what would happen. Not to her, specifically, not to Noah, but to the situation, to see which direction the system would fall when pressure was applied from one side. He said that, in his experience, you learned very little about an organization from its best moments. You learned what it actually was from the moments like this one, when a decision had to be made quickly without an audience that mattered, and when the cost of doing the right thing was small but inconvenient. Amelia listened without interrupting. She had come back here to speak, but she found that listening was more useful, so she stayed crouched in the aisle and let him finish. Elliot said the failure that morning was not catastrophic. It was not malicious. It was the kind of failure that happened when people had learned gradually and without noticing to optimize for comfort rather than correctness, to read a room and respond to the loudest signal rather than the most legitimate one. He said that was the kind of failure that was hardest to fix because it didn't feel like a failure from the inside. It felt like reasonable judgment under pressure. Amelia said she understood that, and that understanding it did not make it easier to sit with. She said the version of herself that had walked out of the cockpit that morning had told herself she was managing a situation. She could see now that she had been managing it in the wrong direction, and the reason she hadn't caught that in the moment was because no one in the immediate environment had given her a reason to stop and check. The man she was removing had not argued. The passenger making the complaint had been calm and credentialed, and the path forward had felt clear. She said that clarity had been the problem. Elliot said he agreed with that. He said clarity that comes too easily is usually borrowed from something other than principle. They looked at each other for a moment, not with the charged discomfort of a confrontation, but with the particular stillness of two people who have said the true thing and are now deciding what to do with it. The aircraft moved through the air around them indifferent. Amelia told him that when they landed, she would be filing a full incident report. She would document what had happened accurately, including her own role in it, and she would not be characterizing the removal as a routine seat change or a passenger management call. She said she did not know what the consequences would be, and that she was not raising the matter because she expected the report to protect her. She raised it because the record should be accurate, and because the next time a situation like this came in front of a crew on one of these flights, there should be something in the system that pushed back. Elliot said that was the right thing to do. He said it without qualification, without the tone of a man granting permission simply as a statement of fact. Amelia stood, and she told him she was going to send Noah back before they landed. She said that was Noah's choice to make, not hers, but that she thought he needed to make it. Elliot said nothing to that which she took as neither objection nor encouragement, and she walked back up the aisle toward the front of the plane. Noah was in the forward galley when she returned. He had been in the forward galley doing small, unnecessary tasks for most of the time she had been gone. She told him where she had been and what she had said, and then she told him without pressure that she thought he should do the same before they landed. She told him that what he did with that was his decision, and she wasn't going to tell him how to make it. Then she went back into the cockpit. Noah stood in the galley for a long time. Long enough that the older woman from row 27 came up to use the forward lavatory, and gave him a brief, curious look on her way past. He thought about 4 years of doing this job well. The attentiveness, the composure, the small, reliable competencies that had built his record into something he was genuinely proud of. He thought about the moment he had stood at the cabin system, read a valid ticket, gone back to Lauren Whitmore and said the right thing, and then, when the right thing met, resistance handed it off instead of holding it. He thought about that sequence with the clear, unsparing attention it deserved. He walked to the back of the plane. When he reached row 27, the window seat passenger was still asleep, and the aisle seat was empty. The older woman hadn't returned yet. Noah stood in the aisle and looked at Elliot, who looked back at him without any particular expression. Noah said he wanted to say something before they landed. Elliot indicated with a slight movement of his hand that he was listening. Noah said he had checked the manifest before any of it happened. He had seen that the ticket was valid and had gone back to the complaining passenger and said so. He wanted to be clear about that, not because it changed anything, but because it was accurate, and he thought the accurate version mattered. Then he said that when the complaining passenger had pushed back, he had taken the path that felt easier and escalated instead of holding his position, and that he had done that knowing the ticket was valid, and that there was no version of that decision he could explain to himself in a way that he felt good about. Elliot said he appreciated Noah telling him that. He said he noticed the difference between someone who came back and offered an explanation and someone who came back and offered an excuse, and that what Noah had just given him was an explanation. Noah said he wasn't sure what the difference was in practical terms. Elliot said the difference was that an excuse is designed to close the matter, and an explanation is designed to understand it. He said only one of those was actually useful going forward. Noah absorbed that. He thanked Elliot, and Elliot gave a small nod that seemed to indicate the conversation was complete, and Noah walked back up the aisle to prepare the cabin for landing. 20 minutes before touchdown, Amelia's voice came through the cabin speaker in the standard landing announcement. Seat backs, tray tables, window shades. Lauren Whitmore closed her leather portfolio and slid it into her bag. She accepted the flight attendant's collection of her final drink glass with a murmured thank you and turned to look out the window at the brown expanse of the greater Los Angeles basin coming into view below. It was then that Amelia came out of the cockpit again, briefly visibly, and walked to Lauren's row and crouched in the aisle the same way she had crouched in row 27. Lauren turned from the window with the faint expression of someone who expected a routine courtesy and found something else instead. Amelia said she needed to tell her something before they landed. She said that the passenger who had been moved from seat 2A that morning had been removed without cause. His ticket was fully valid, his conduct had been without issue, and the removal had been a mistake her mistake made in response to the complaint Lauren had filed, and she wanted Lauren to hear that directly from her rather than through any other channel. She said she was not raising it to assign blame in any direction, but because she believed that if you participated in something that went wrong, you deserved to know what had gone wrong and why. Lauren's expression shifted through several stages in the space of about 4 seconds. The first was surprise, the kind that arrives before the mind has finished processing. The second was the reflexive composure of someone who does not like to be caught off balance in public. The third was something harder to name, not guilt exactly, but its close neighbor, the recognition that arrives when you realize a thing you set in motion has a shape you did not intend. She said she had raised a legitimate concern. Amelia said she understood that, and that the error had not been in receiving the concern, but in how she had acted on it. She said she was not there to tell Lauren she had done anything illegal or to suggest she was responsible for the captain's decision. She was there because the captain's decision had been wrong, and Lauren had been in the room when it was made, and the truth of what had happened deserved to be said out loud to everyone who had witnessed it. Lauren said nothing after that. She turned back to the window. Amelia stood, straightened her uniform jacket, and returned to the cockpit for landing. Flight 417 touched down at Los Angeles at 11:14 in the morning, 7 minutes ahead of schedule. The cabin filled with the sounds of seatbelts unclicking and overhead bins opening, the shuffle and compression of 160 people reorganizing themselves into individuals again. Business class deplaned first, as it always did. Lauren Whitmore gathered her portfolio and her handbag and walked off the aircraft without looking back. Elliot Hayes was among the last to leave. He made his way up the aisle at the pace of the passengers ahead of him, retrieved his leather bag from the overhead bin in row 27, and moved through the economy cabin toward the forward door. When he passed the galley, Noah was standing there conducting the post-flight check. Noah looked up. He didn't say anything. Elliot gave him the same small nod he had given in the cabin, the one that indicated a thing was understood and did not require additional words, and continued toward the door. Amelia was standing at the aircraft door in the standard position for deplaning. She was looking at the jetway, not at the passengers, the way crew members sometimes do when they are holding something internal and don't want it to show. When Elliot reached the door, she turned. She said she hoped he had a good rest of his day. He said the same to her, and he meant it. Not as a courtesy, not as the kind of thing a person says because the situation calls for something, but because he had watched her walk back through the cabin under no obligation to do so, crouch in an economy aisle and tell the truth about herself without softening it or redirecting it, and he respected what that had cost her. He stepped off the aircraft and into the jetway and walked toward the terminal without requesting anything, without identifying himself to anyone, without using a single privilege that was not available to the man in the seat beside him. The gate was already being prepared for the next departure. The ground crew was moving outside the windows. The business of the airline continued in every direction, indifferent to what had happened on one flight, among hundreds, on one Tuesday morning, among thousands. But Amelia's incident report would be filed before the day was out, and it would say exactly what had happened in the order. It had happened, with every name included. And somewhere in the operational structure that Elliot Hayes had spent 22 years building a record would exist of a system that had failed, and of 3 people who had each in their own way and in their own time tried to reckon with what that failure meant. The terminal absorbed Elliot Hayes the same way it had produced him, without ceremony, without recognition, without any signal that the man walking through it was anything other than a passenger at the end of an ordinary flight. That was exactly how he had wanted it. It was also, he understood now, the thing that had made every choice on that aircraft visible for exactly what it was. Not the choices people make when someone is watching, but the choices they make when they believe, with complete confidence that no one who matters ever will be.